Some people feel it first. It doesn't appear on the news, no one announces it, but something in the world simply starts to feel different. Small patterns begin to change. Coincidences seem to increase. Certain things stop making complete sense in the way they used to. Most people pass right through these moments without noticing anything unusual. Life continues, routines stay the same, and the mind keeps moving from one task to the next. But a few people pause. They sense that something subtle has shifted in the background of reality, even if they can't fully explain what it is. And that raises a fascinating question. Why do some minds notice this, while others continue living normally? If you have ever had the strange feeling that reality sometimes seems slightly out of place, there may be a deeper reason for that. But there is also a silent mistake that almost everyone makes when they begin to notice these changes. It rarely begins with something dramatic, no loud event, no sudden revelation, no moment that clearly announces something in reality has shifted. Instead, the first signal is almost always quiet. So quiet that most people erase it instantly. It might begin with a pattern that repeats in a way that feels slightly unusual. Maybe you notice the same number appearing throughout the day, on a clock, on a receipt, on a street sign. Individually, each moment means nothing. The mind quickly files it away as coincidence. But then it happens again and again, not in a mystical or exaggerated way, just enough to create a small disturbance in the background of your attention. Most people immediately neutralize that disturbance. They say to themselves, "It's nothing," or "I'm just imagining things." And just like that, the signal disappears. Not because it stopped happening, but because the mind closed the door on it. The first signal reality sends is not meant to convince you. It is only meant to be noticed. And noticing requires something that modern life quietly trains out of us: patience with uncertainty. For a brief moment, something feels slightly out of place. You walk into a conversation and hear someone say the exact phrase that was in your mind moments earlier. You think about someone you haven't spoken to in years, and later that day their name appears somewhere unexpectedly. You feel a strange familiarity in a place you've never been before, as if part of you recognizes the situation before it unfolds. Each event alone is small enough to dismiss. So most people do. The mind prefers a stable map of reality, predictable, logical, explained. When something doesn't fit that map, the fastest solution is to ignore it and move forward. And most of the time, that works perfectly well. But for a few people, something slightly different happens. Instead of immediately closing the door, they pause for a moment. Not because they believe something supernatural is happening, not because they are searching for signs. They simply notice the anomaly. It's a subtle shift in behavior. Instead of dismissing the moment, they hold it in their awareness for a few seconds longer than usual. They allow the question to exist. That was strange. Nothing more dramatic than that. No conclusions, no grand interpretations, just attention. This small difference, just a few extra seconds of honest observation, changes everything. Because reality often speaks in patterns too subtle for a distracted mind to catch. Think about how many things your attention ignores every day. The human brain is constantly filtering information to protect you from overload. Sounds, movements, conversations, visual details, almost all of it is discarded automatically. Your mind builds a simplified version of reality so you can function efficiently. But that filter comes with a side effect. Anything that doesn't immediately match what your brain considers normal is usually discarded before you even realize it was there. The repeating number, the strange coincidence, the oddly timed message, the subtle feeling that a moment has a kind of meaning that logic cannot immediately explain. These signals often appear for only a fraction of a second in your awareness before the mind quietly sweeps them away. For most people, the process is so fast that it never becomes conscious. Life continues as usual. The day moves forward. Nothing seems different. But occasionally, someone interrupts that automatic process. They notice the coincidence, and instead of instantly dismissing it, they remain curious for a moment. Not obsessed, not convinced, just curious. Curiosity is the doorway that allows subtle patterns to remain visible long enough to be recognized. Without it, Everything unusual is erased before it can form a larger picture. And that is why the first signal is almost always ignored. Not because it is hidden, not because reality is trying to be mysterious, but because the human brain is designed to protect its existing model of the world. Anything that challenges that model is treated as noise, and most of the time, the brain wins that battle instantly. But occasionally, attention wins. In those moments, something very interesting begins to happen. The mind starts noticing small inconsistencies between what it expects and what actually occurs. At first, these inconsistencies are tiny, barely worth mentioning. Yet when someone begins to pay attention to them, not forcefully, not obsessively, but calmly, they begin to realize something surprising. The world contains far more information than their mind normally allows through, which leads to a deeper and more unsettling question. If the brain is constantly filtering reality, what exactly is it filtering out? Every second, your senses receive an overwhelming amount of information: light entering your eyes, subtle sounds in the distance, changes in temperature, movements in your peripheral vision, the rhythm of your breathing, the pressure of your feet on the ground, fragments of conversations around you, distant traffic, shifting shadows, hundreds of visual details in every direction. If your mind tried to process all of it consciously, you would be completely paralyzed by the sheer volume of data. So the brain does something extraordinary. It filters. Without asking for permission, your brain constantly decides what is important enough to enter your awareness and what should be discarded before you even notice it. This process is happening right now, silently shaping the version of reality you experience. You may think you are seeing the world exactly as it is, but what you are actually seeing is a carefully edited summary. The brain builds this summary based on expectations. It compares what your senses detect with what it already believes the world should look like. If something matches that expectation, it passes through easily. If it doesn't, the brain often removes it before it ever becomes a conscious thought. This is one of the reasons routines feel so automatic. When you drive the same road every day, your mind stops noticing most of the details. Buildings, signs, trees, even entire streets become background noise. Your brain has already labeled them as familiar, so it stops sending them to your conscious attention. In other words, your brain is constantly protecting a stable model of reality. It prefers the known. It prefers the predictable. And anything that challenges that internal map must pass through a kind of invisible gatekeeper. Most unusual signals never make it through. Imagine walking through a crowded airport while waiting for someone to call your name. Thousands of voices fill the space, but the moment your name is spoken, your attention immediately locks onto it. Your brain suddenly pulls that signal out of the noise. The sound was always there. Your ears were receiving it, but until it matched something meaningful to you, it remained invisible to your awareness. This filtering system is incredibly efficient. It allows you to function in a complex world without being overwhelmed, but it also means that your experience of reality is far more selective than you might realize. Many things exist around you that your brain simply decides are not relevant enough to show you, and most of the time that decision is correct. But occasionally something unusual appears, something that doesn't fit the brain's expectations, a coincidence that feels oddly precise, a pattern repeating across different moments, a sudden sense that two events, which should be unrelated, seem strangely connected. When this happens, the brain experiences a brief moment of conflict. The incoming information does not match the existing map, and the brain must choose between two options. The first option is the easiest: discard the signal. Label it as coincidence, imagination, or error. Push it out of awareness and return to the stable version of reality. This is what happens most of the time. But sometimes the signal is just strong enough, or repeated just enough, that the brain hesitates before discarding it. That hesitation is important, because during that small pause, the mind begins to examine something it would normally ignore. This is where certain people begin to notice things others never register, not because they have special abilities, not because they are searching for hidden meanings, but because their attention allows unusual signals to remain visible a little longer. They don't immediately force the world back into the shape they expect. They allow the possibility that their internal map might be incomplete, and when the brain relaxes its grip on certainty, the filter changes. It doesn't disappear, but it becomes slightly more flexible. Details that once seemed irrelevant begin to pass through. Patterns that once looked like noise start to form recognizable shapes, and slowly, the world appears a little more complex than before. At first, this can feel almost unsettling, because the brain is realizing something it rarely confronts. The reality you experience is not the full picture. It is a reduced version created for efficiency, and when that filter loosens, even slightly, new patterns can start appearing in places where there once seemed to be randomness. You might notice connections between events that previously felt unrelated. You might begin recognizing moments of timing that feel almost too precise. You might start observing a strange rhythm in the way certain things happen. And when these patterns begin appearing more often, a question quietly emerges in the mind. Are these events actually increasing? Or are you simply becoming aware of something that was always happening around you? Because when attention shifts and the filter opens just a little wider, something very curious begins to occur. The number of meaningful coincidences people report tends to rise. At first, it happens so quietly that you almost hesitate to mention it. A thought crosses your mind about someone you haven't spoken to in years. There is no clear reason for it, just a passing memory, a brief image of their face, and then you move on with your day. Hours later, their name appears on your phone. Maybe they send a message. Maybe someone else brings them up in conversation. Maybe you see their name somewhere completely unrelated. When it happens once, it feels like coincidence. When it happens again, it feels curious. But when moments like this begin appearing repeatedly, something deeper starts to unfold inside the mind. You begin to pay closer attention, not in an obsessive way, just enough to notice that certain events feel strangely timed, as if the distance between a thought and an external event is becoming smaller. You think about a specific idea, and later that day you encounter the exact topic in a book, a conversation, or a video. You consider making a decision, and suddenly several situations appear that seem to point you in the same direction. You remember a place you once visited, and unexpectedly someone mentions it that same day. None of these moments are dramatic on their own. Each one can easily be explained away as random chance, and that is usually the explanation most people choose. But when these events begin forming a pattern, something inside you hesitates before dismissing them, not because you are convinced there is something mystical happening, but because the timing begins to feel precise. Almost as if reality has a subtle rhythm that becomes visible only when attention slows down. The word often used to describe these moments is synchronicity. It was popularized by the psychologist Carl Jung, who described synchronicities as meaningful coincidences, events that appear connected not through direct cause, but through timing and significance. Two events occur that logically should have nothing to do with each other. Yet when they happen together, they feel connected in a way that logic alone struggles to explain. For example, imagine reading about a specific concept you have never encountered before. The next day you hear two different people mention the same concept independently, or you begin thinking about changing something in your life, and suddenly you encounter several conversations or ideas that seem to revolve around that same change. Individually, each moment is ordinary. Together, they start forming a pattern that feels strangely aligned with your attention. At this point, the mind begins asking a question that can feel both fascinating and uncomfortable. Are these events actually increasing? Or are you simply noticing them now because your attention has changed? This is where the experience becomes delicate, because there are two easy mistakes the mind can make. The first is immediate dismissal. The brain quickly labels everything as coincidence and refuses to look any deeper. Every unusual event is pushed aside, and the possibility of meaningful patterns is ignored completely. But the opposite mistake is just as dangerous. Instead of dismissing everything, the mind starts assigning meaning to every small event. Every number becomes a message, every random encounter becomes a sign, every coincidence becomes part of a hidden system guiding your life. When this happens, the mind stops observing reality clearly. It begins projecting meaning everywhere. Both extremes move you away from understanding what is actually happening. But there is a quieter path between these two reactions, a path that requires something simple but surprisingly rare: calm observation. Instead of immediately rejecting coincidences, you simply notice them. Instead of instantly assigning meaning, you remain curious. You allow the event to exist without forcing it into a conclusion. Something interesting happens when the mind adopts this posture. The world begins to feel slightly more alive, not in a supernatural sense, but in a subtle psychological way. Your attention becomes more sensitive to timing, to patterns, to connections between events that previously slipped past unnoticed. It becomes easier to see how thoughts influence decisions, how decisions influence actions, and how those actions quietly shape the events that follow. The boundary between internal experience and external reality begins to feel less rigid than before. You start to see that your attention is not just passively observing the world, it is participating in it. And when people begin noticing synchronicities more often, this is usually the moment where confusion appears, because the mind naturally wants a clear explanation. Is reality responding to your attention, or are you simply becoming aware of patterns that were always there? This question is far more important than it might seem, because depending on how someone answers it, their entire understanding of reality can begin to shift. And unfortunately, this is exactly where many people take a wrong turn without realizing it. When people begin noticing unusual patterns in their lives, something very predictable tends to happen inside the mind. At first, there is curiosity. A few coincidences appear. Certain events seem strangely timed. Thoughts and external situations occasionally line up in ways that feel difficult to ignore. For a brief moment, the mind becomes more attentive. But then a tension appears. Because the brain is uncomfortable with uncertainty, it wants a clear explanation, something stable that restores order to the way reality makes sense. And this is where the dangerous mistake begins. Instead of staying in the quiet space of observation, most people rush toward one of two extremes. The first extreme is total dismissal. The mind becomes almost defensive. Every coincidence is immediately explained away. Every unusual pattern is labeled as imagination, bias, or randomness. The person convinces themselves that noticing anything unusual is foolish or irrational, so they shut the door completely. They stop paying attention. They force reality back into a rigid frame where everything must have a simple explanation. And once that door closes, the subtle signals that once caught their attention disappear again. Not necessarily because they stopped happening, but because the mind has decided they are not worth noticing. In this extreme, perception becomes narrow again. Curiosity disappears. The person returns to the comfortable assumption that the world is entirely predictable and that all patterns beyond obvious cause and effect are illusions. But the other extreme is just as problematic. Instead of rejecting every coincidence, the mind begins doing the opposite. It starts searching for meaning everywhere. Every repeating number becomes a hidden message. Every unexpected encounter becomes a sign. Every small coincidence begins to feel like evidence that reality is sending personal signals. At first, this can feel exciting. Life seems full of hidden guidance. Every event appears connected to some deeper intention. The person begins interpreting everyday moments as if they are part of a coded system designed specifically for them. But slowly, something subtle begins to break. Observation turns into projection. Instead of seeing what is actually happening, the mind starts inserting meaning into every detail. Random events are forced into patterns that may not truly exist. The world becomes less clear, not more. And this is the strange paradox. Both extremes distort perception. Total dismissal closes the door on curiosity. Total interpretation replaces observation with imagination. In both cases, the mind stops seeing reality as it is. What makes this mistake so common is that the human brain is naturally uncomfortable with ambiguity. It prefers certainty, even if that certainty is wrong. Living in the middle space between skepticism and belief requires patience. It requires the ability to notice unusual events without immediately trying to control the meaning of those events. Very few people are comfortable doing that. But the people who begin to understand these experiences tend to follow a different path. When something unusual happens, a coincidence, a strange alignment of events, they do not rush to conclusions. They notice it, they acknowledge it, and then they let it remain open. No forced explanation, no exaggerated interpretation, just awareness. Over time, this simple practice begins to sharpen perception. Patterns can be observed more clearly because they are not being distorted by the need to prove something. If a coincidence is truly random, it fades naturally. If a pattern is real, it becomes clearer through repetition. But that clarity can only emerge when the mind stops trying to force reality into a narrative. This is why the rare path between dismissal and obsession is so powerful. It allows perception to stay flexible, it allows curiosity to remain alive, and it keeps the mind grounded in observation rather than belief. What many people don't realize is that this balanced state of awareness is not just philosophical. It actually changes the way the brain processes information. When someone observes reality calmly, without rushing to conclusions, the brain becomes more sensitive to subtle signals in the environment. Attention becomes sharper, patterns become easier to recognize, connections between events become more visible, and gradually, the person begins to experience something that feels almost surprising. Reality seems to respond differently to a mind that is truly paying attention, not in a magical sense, but in a way that suggests observation itself may play a deeper role in shaping experience than we usually assume. And interestingly, this idea is not limited to psychology or philosophy. Even in modern physics, the act of observation has been shown to influence the behavior of systems in ways that once seemed impossible. For a long time, observation was treated as something passive. The world existed independently, and the role of the observer was simply to watch and record what was already happening. In this view, reality moved forward on its own, and human perception was just a window looking out at it. But as science began studying the smallest levels of nature, something strange appeared. In certain experiments within quantum physics, the behavior of particles seemed to change depending on whether they were being observed or not. When a system was measured, the outcome was different than when it remained unobserved. For many people hearing about this idea for the first time, it sounds almost unbelievable. The suggestion that observation might influence reality feels more like philosophy than science. Yet the experiments themselves are very real. The important thing, however, is not to jump to mystical conclusions. Physicists do not claim that human thoughts magically control the universe. The systems involved are extremely precise and operate under very specific conditions. But what these discoveries revealed was something profound. Observation is not always neutral. In some cases, the act of measuring or interacting with a system becomes part of the system itself. The observer is no longer completely separate from what is being observed. This idea begins to feel even more interesting when we bring it back to everyday human experience. Because perception is not just about seeing the world. Perception also shapes how we interact with it. Think about how attention changes behavior. When you focus on something, your actions begin adjusting around it. Decisions shift, reactions change. Small choices begin aligning with whatever your mind is paying attention to. If you start paying close attention to your health, you begin noticing food choices more carefully. You become aware of how your body feels after certain habits. Slowly, your behavior starts changing. If you focus your attention on a particular goal, your mind begins recognizing opportunities that were previously invisible. The opportunities were always there, but without attention, they passed by unnoticed. In this way, observation quietly reshapes the path of events, not because reality itself is bending to your thoughts, but because attention changes how you move through the system you are part of. Your awareness influences decisions. Your decisions influence actions, and your actions influence the situations that unfold around you. When people begin noticing patterns or coincidences more frequently, it is often because their awareness has become more active inside this process. They are no longer moving through life on pure autopilot. They are watching more carefully. They are noticing how thoughts arise, how choices are made, and how small moments lead into larger outcomes. This increased awareness creates a subtle feedback loop. The more consciously someone observes their experience, the more clearly they begin seeing the connections between inner states and external events. At first, these connections are small. A decision you almost ignored leads to an unexpected opportunity. A conversation you nearly avoided reveals something important. A moment of curiosity leads you to information that changes your direction. These moments can feel surprisingly precise when viewed in hindsight, and when several of them begin appearing close together, the experience can feel as if reality itself is responding to your awareness. But something deeper is actually happening. Conscious attention changes the quality of perception. When someone becomes more aware of their thoughts, emotions, and environment, they also become more aware of the choices they are making within each moment. And those choices quietly influence the chain of events that follow. It is like adjusting the direction of a ship by just a few degrees. At first, the change is barely noticeable, but over time, that small shift leads to an entirely different destination. The same thing happens in everyday life. When consciousness becomes more present, the path of decisions becomes more deliberate. And when decisions become more deliberate, the structure of experience begins to change. This is why people sometimes feel as if reality is responding to them when their awareness increases. In a way, it is. Because they are no longer moving through life unconsciously. They are interacting with it. And as this interaction becomes more conscious, something curious begins to appear. Patterns that once seemed random start forming clearer sequences. Events that once felt disconnected begin aligning in ways that feel almost coordinated. Some people describe this moment as if reality is acknowledging their attention, almost like a quiet signal saying, "Now you are paying attention." Whether this feeling is psychological, behavioral, or something deeper is still a question that science and philosophy continue to explore. But many people report a similar experience. Once awareness becomes sharper, the number of meaningful patterns in life seems to increase, and this leads to another curious moment that often appears soon after. People begin noticing patterns, and shortly after, those patterns seem to appear even more often. After someone begins paying closer attention to the patterns in their life, a very curious phase often appears. At first, the person simply notices small coincidences. A thought aligns with a conversation. A question appears in the mind, and later that day the answer seems to show up somewhere unexpected. A random idea leads to an encounter that feels strangely well-timed. In the beginning, these moments are occasional, but once attention becomes sharper, something surprising tends to happen. The patterns seem to increase, not slowly, sometimes almost immediately. People often describe it in a similar way. It feels as if reality suddenly becomes more responsive, as if the moment you begin noticing the subtle signals around you, those signals begin appearing more frequently. You think about someone and they contact you. You consider changing direction in your life, and suddenly you encounter conversations, opportunities, or information that seem connected to that decision. You start paying attention to a specific idea, and suddenly that idea appears everywhere, in books, discussions, articles, or unexpected places. When this happens several times in a short period, the experience can feel almost personal, as if reality itself is acknowledging your awareness. Some people even describe the feeling as though the world is quietly saying, "Now that you noticed, here is more." But this is where it becomes important to slow down and examine what might actually be happening, because there are two possible explanations for this experience, and both are worth considering carefully. The first explanation is psychological. When your attention focuses on something, your brain becomes extremely sensitive to related information. This is part of how human perception works. The mind highlights what it considers relevant and begins detecting it everywhere. For example, imagine someone thinking about buying a specific car model. Before that thought appeared, they may have rarely noticed that car on the road. But once the idea becomes important to them, suddenly that same car seems to appear everywhere. It feels as if the number of those cars has increased, but in reality, the cars were always there. The difference is attention. The brain now prioritizes that information, pulling it out of the environment more quickly and more frequently. The same mechanism may explain many moments of synchronicity. Once the mind becomes interested in patterns, it becomes better at recognizing them. But there is another layer to consider. Attention does not only change what you see, it also changes how you act. When someone becomes more conscious of their thoughts and surroundings, their behavior begins to shift in subtle ways. They may respond differently to conversations. They may notice opportunities they previously ignored. They may make decisions that open new paths of interaction. These small behavioral shifts ripple outward. A conversation you decide to engage in leads to meeting someone new. A topic you decide to explore leads to information that changes your perspective. A moment of curiosity leads you somewhere you would not have gone before. Each small action influences the next event that unfolds. From the outside, this chain of events can look almost like perfect timing, but underneath it, there is a dynamic process unfolding between awareness, decision, and environment. When awareness increases, participation increases. You are no longer drifting through events without noticing how they connect. You begin influencing the direction of those events through the choices you make in response to what you observe. This creates the feeling that reality is responding. In some ways, it is not an illusion, because when consciousness becomes more present, the relationship between you and the world becomes more interactive. Life stops feeling like something that is simply happening to you. It starts feeling like a system you are actively moving within. And once someone reaches this stage, another realization often appears. Not everyone seems to experience this. Many people move through life without ever noticing these patterns. The same coincidences, the same subtle connections, the same moments of timing may be happening around them, but they pass by completely unnoticed. Their attention is somewhere else, focused on routines, responsibilities, worries, distractions. The signals that feel so obvious to one mind remain invisible to another, which raises an interesting question. If these patterns are part of everyday reality, why do so many people never notice them at all? The answer may have less to do with intelligence or awareness, and much more to do with something that quietly shapes modern life every single day. Most people move through their days inside a very narrow corridor of attention. Wake up, check the phone, think about work, solve problems, handle responsibilities, worry about bills, deadlines, family matters, unfinished tasks. Move from one obligation to the next while the mind constantly jumps between past concerns and future plans. In this state, attention becomes fragmented. The mind is rarely resting in the present moment long enough to notice subtle details in the environment. Instead, it is occupied with internal noise, thoughts, worries, calculations, distractions. And when attention is consumed like this, something important disappears. Sensitivity, not emotional sensitivity, but perceptual sensitivity, the ability to notice small shifts, patterns, and timing in the world around you. Imagine walking through a forest while speaking loudly on the phone. Your eyes may pass over the trees, the movement of the wind, the sound of distant birds, the pattern of light filtering through the leaves. But your awareness is somewhere else. You technically see the forest, but you are not truly observing it. The same thing happens in everyday life. People move through conversations without fully listening. They pass through environments without noticing what is happening around them. They encounter small coincidences, but dismiss them instantly because their mind is already rushing toward the next task. Modern life encourages this kind of mental speed. The faster everything moves, the less space there is for quiet observation. Information flows constantly. Notifications, messages, news updates, endless streams of content competing for attention. Each one pulls the mind in a slightly different direction. Over time, this creates a kind of mental anesthesia. The mind becomes numb to subtle signals. Only the loudest events capture attention. Problems, crises, urgent demands, strong emotions. Everything quieter fades into the background. But the patterns people describe when they talk about synchronicities or meaningful timing are rarely loud events. They are subtle, a thought appearing just before an encounter, a small decision that unexpectedly changes a future opportunity, a conversation that arrives at the exact moment you needed a certain idea. These moments are easy to miss if the mind is moving too fast. It is like trying to notice the movement of stars while standing under bright city lights. The stars are still there, but the surrounding noise makes them difficult to see. When someone begins slowing their attention, even slightly, the experience of reality begins to change. Not because the world itself suddenly becomes different, but because the mind is finally available to observe what is already happening. Small details begin to stand out. The timing of events becomes more noticeable. The connections between moments become easier to recognize. It is almost as if the world reveals additional layers that were previously hidden in plain sight. This is one reason certain people begin noticing patterns earlier than others. They are not necessarily more intelligent or more spiritual. Often, they have simply developed the habit of paying attention. Maybe they spend more time in quiet reflection. Maybe they question their routines more often. Maybe they allow themselves moments where the mind is not constantly occupied with stimulation. Whatever the reason, their awareness becomes more open. And when attention opens, perception deepens. The brain begins allowing more information through its filters. Details that once seemed irrelevant now become visible. A subtle shift in someone's tone during a conversation. A repeating theme across several unrelated events. A feeling that a particular moment carries more significance than it first appeared. For someone whose attention is constantly scattered, these details remain invisible. But for someone who observes the world with a little more presence, they begin forming patterns. And once those patterns become visible, something surprising often happens. Events that once felt random start connecting in ways that are difficult to ignore. Decisions that once seemed small begin revealing consequences that stretch far into the future. Moments that seemed ordinary begin showing how they quietly shape the direction of an entire life path. At first, this realization can feel unsettling, because it challenges the comforting idea that everything in life is simply random. When someone begins seeing how small choices and subtle moments influence much larger outcomes, the structure of reality begins to look different. It starts to feel less like chaos and more like a sensitive network of cause, attention, and timing. And when this realization deepens, another shift often follows. The mind begins reconsidering a question it may have never asked before. What if reality has always been responding to consciousness in small ways, but most people were simply too distracted to see it? There is a quiet moment that many people experience after they begin paying closer attention to the patterns in their lives. It does not arrive suddenly like a revelation. It builds slowly, almost invisibly, through small observations that accumulate over time. At first, nothing seems extraordinary. You simply begin noticing how certain moments connect to others. A decision made months ago suddenly reveals why you ended up in a specific place. A conversation that once seemed unimportant later becomes the turning point for something much larger. The mind starts looking backward and realizing that many events were not as random as they once appeared. A job you almost didn't accept introduced you to someone who later changed the direction of your life. A book you found by accident exposed you to an idea that reshaped the way you think. A place you decided to visit without a clear reason placed you in an environment where something important unfolded. When viewed individually, these moments feel ordinary. But when you step back and look at the path they created, a pattern begins to appear. Small choices lead to encounters. Encounters lead to opportunities. Opportunities lead to new decisions. And each decision opens a new set of possibilities that did not exist before. Gradually, the mind begins to see life less as a sequence of random events and more as a chain of interactions between awareness, choice, and circumstance. This is often the moment when something begins to make sense in a way it never did before, not because the universe suddenly reveals a hidden plan, but because the connections between events become visible once attention sharpens. You begin noticing how sensitive life is to small moments of awareness. A single conversation can shift your perspective. A single decision can redirect years of your future. A single moment of curiosity can lead you into knowledge that changes how you see the world. These moments often feel insignificant when they happen, but over time, they reveal how delicate the structure of experience actually is. Life does not always move in large, dramatic leaps. More often, it moves through tiny adjustments that quietly change the direction of everything that follows. When someone begins recognizing this, the idea of randomness starts to feel incomplete. Not necessarily false, but incomplete, because randomness alone does not fully explain the way certain moments seem to align with the exact questions someone is asking at that point in their life. For example, many people recall times when they were deeply searching for clarity about something. During that period, they encountered a conversation, an idea, or a piece of information that arrived at precisely the moment it was needed. At the time, it might have seemed like coincidence, but looking back later, the timing feels almost too precise to ignore. Experiences like this do not prove that reality is controlled by some hidden force, but they do reveal something interesting about the relationship between attention and experience. When the mind becomes more conscious, it becomes more sensitive to the paths life is offering. Choices are made with greater awareness. Opportunities are noticed more quickly. Subtle signals that once went unnoticed begin guiding decisions in quiet ways. The result is that life begins to feel more coherent. Events that once felt disconnected start forming understandable sequences. You begin seeing how certain questions lead you towards certain environments, how certain environments expose you to certain people, how those people introduce ideas that shift your direction. In hindsight, the path begins to look almost intentional. But the key realization here is not that everything was predetermined. The realization is that consciousness played a role in shaping which paths became visible to you. Your attention influenced your decisions. Your decisions influenced your experiences, and your experiences influenced the events that followed. When this becomes clear, the relationship between mind and reality begins to feel more interactive than it once did. You start understanding that awareness is not just something happening inside your head, it is part of how you move through the world. And once this understanding settles in, another shift in perspective begins to emerge. You start realizing that the people who notice these patterns first are not necessarily special. They may have simply allowed themselves to observe reality without resisting what they see. For a long time, many people assume that those who notice unusual patterns in life must possess something rare. Perhaps they are more spiritual, more intuitive, more sensitive to hidden forces in the universe. It is easy to believe that some people are simply born with a special ability to perceive what others cannot. But when you look closely at how this awareness actually develops, a different picture begins to appear. The difference is often much simpler. Some people stopped resisting what they observe. Most minds carry a very strong need for the world to remain predictable. We feel safer when reality behaves according to the models we already understand. When events follow clear explanations, the mind relaxes. But when something unusual happens, an unexpected coincidence, a strange alignment of events, a moment that feels slightly too precise, many people instinctively push it away. Not because they carefully examined it and found it meaningless, but because accepting the possibility that reality might be more complex than expected creates discomfort. It challenges the stability of the mental map we use to navigate the world. So the mind quickly restores order. It's just random. Things like that happen all the time. It doesn't mean anything. These statements may sometimes be correct. Many coincidences truly are random. But the speed with which the mind dismisses unusual events often reveals something deeper. It reveals resistance. The brain prefers a world where everything fits inside familiar explanations. Anything that stretches beyond that boundary feels threatening to the sense of certainty we depend on. But some people respond differently when they encounter these moments. Instead of rushing to protect their existing model of reality, they allow themselves to look directly at what is happening. They do not force a mystical interpretation. They do not assume the moment has a hidden message. They simply observe it without immediately rejecting it. This may sound like a small difference, but it changes everything. Because the moment you stop resisting perception, your relationship with reality becomes more open. The mind no longer filters out every signal that does not match its expectations. It becomes willing to explore. Imagine two people walking through the same unfamiliar city. One of them constantly tries to confirm that the city behaves exactly like the places they already know. They follow familiar routes, look for predictable patterns, and ignore anything that feels unusual. The other person walks through the same streets with curiosity. They notice small details, unexpected paths, new sounds, unfamiliar interactions. Both people are in the same environment, but the second person experiences a far richer version of it. The same principle applies to perception itself. Reality may contain many subtle layers of information, patterns, and timing that most people simply overlook because their attention is tightly locked to what feels familiar. When someone loosens that grip even slightly, the environment begins revealing details that were always present but previously ignored. This shift can feel profound because it challenges the idea that awareness is passive. Instead of simply observing a fixed world, consciousness becomes something that participates in how the world is experienced. When attention becomes more open, the mind begins detecting patterns that once appeared invisible. When resistance fades, curiosity grows. And curiosity allows perception to move beyond the narrow boundaries of expectation. But this shift also requires something that many people find uncomfortable. It requires the willingness to look into the unknown without immediately demanding certainty. Most people want clear answers. They want to know exactly what something means, exactly why it happened, exactly how the system works. Yet, many of the deeper patterns in life reveal themselves slowly, through observation over time rather than instant explanation. The people who begin noticing these patterns first are often those who have developed patience with that process. They allow themselves to see what is happening before deciding what it means. They do not rush to control the narrative. They watch, and by watching carefully, they begin recognizing something subtle. The ability to notice shifts in reality may have less to do with special insight and more to do with a very simple habit. The habit of conscious attention. And once someone begins practicing that kind of attention, a final realization often begins to take shape. In the end, the difference between the people who notice these shifts and those who don't is rarely what most imagine. It is not a matter of intelligence. Some extremely intelligent people move through life without ever noticing these subtle patterns. Their minds are sharp, analytical, capable of solving complex problems, yet their attention remains fixed on practical tasks and immediate goals. It is also not simply about spirituality. Many people deeply interested in spiritual ideas still miss what is happening in front of them because they are focused on beliefs rather than observation. The real difference often comes down to something much simpler: attention. Not the distracted kind of attention that jumps from thought to thought, but a quieter form of awareness that stays present long enough to notice what is actually happening. Most minds are constantly moving. They move between past memories and future plans. They replay conversations, imagine outcomes, calculate risks, worry about problems that may never happen. Even during moments that appear calm on the outside, the inner world is often filled with noise. When attention is constantly occupied like this, perception becomes narrow. The mind sees only what it expects to see. Everything else fades into the background. But when someone begins practicing conscious attention, something subtle changes in the way they experience the world. Instead of rushing through moments, they allow themselves to observe them. Instead of immediately interpreting events, they watch how those events unfold. Instead of forcing conclusions, they remain curious. This kind of awareness creates space. And inside that space, patterns that once passed unnoticed begin to appear. You start noticing the timing of things. You notice how certain conversations happen right after specific questions arise in your mind. You notice how small decisions quietly shape the situations you encounter later. You notice how a moment of hesitation or curiosity can redirect the path of an entire day. None of these observations require mystical explanations. They simply require presence. The more present someone becomes, the more sensitive their perception becomes to the structure of experience itself. It becomes easier to see how attention influences behavior, how behavior influences outcomes, and how outcomes create the next set of possibilities. Life begins to reveal itself as a dynamic system rather than a sequence of disconnected events. And once someone starts seeing this clearly, they realize something important. The shifts they notice in reality may not be happening earlier for them than for anyone else. They are simply noticing them first, because their attention arrived first. Imagine a quiet change beginning to unfold in a large room. Perhaps a subtle sound appears in one corner, or a small movement begins in the background. Most people in the room are busy with their own conversations. Their attention is directed elsewhere, so the change goes unnoticed. But one person pauses. They are not distracted at that moment. Their awareness is open enough to detect something unusual. They notice the change, not because the event happened only for them, but because their attention happened to be available. The same principle may apply to the patterns and shifts people sometimes perceive in life. Reality may always contain subtle signals, changes in circumstances, emerging opportunities, connections between events that slowly shape the direction of things. But only a mind that is attentive can detect those signals early. And when someone does notice them, their behavior naturally begins to adjust. They may ask different questions. They may explore different paths. They may respond to situations with a level of awareness that others have not yet developed. Over time, these small differences compound. The person begins navigating life with a deeper sensitivity to timing, to connection, to the quiet influence of attention on experience. From the outside, it can look as if they are somehow ahead of others, as if they are seeing shifts in reality before anyone else does. But in truth, they simply looked carefully at what was already there. And that simple act, looking without rushing, without fear, without denial, can quietly transform the way a person experiences the world. Because the moment a mind begins paying real attention, something changes, not only in what it sees, but in the way reality itself begins to unfold in response to that awareness. Sometimes the biggest changes in reality don't begin outside of you. They begin in the moment you start truly paying attention. Most people move through life on automatic, seeing only what their mind expects to see. But when attention becomes calm, curious, and present, the world starts revealing patterns that once felt invisible. Not because reality suddenly changed, but because you finally looked. And once a mind learns to observe life this way, something subtle happens. Moments feel more connected, decisions become more conscious, and the path ahead stops feeling completely random. So if you stayed with this reflection until the end, write this sentence in the comments: I finally see. It's a simple way for me to know you made it all the way here. And if this idea made you see reality a little differently, take a moment to watch one of the videos appearing on your screen now. If this kind of exploration resonates with you, the next one will take this conversation even deeper.